All right, so okay, we'll wait for this screen to come on. Okay, so for those of you who just got here, we haven't really started yet. We're kind of waiting out with this bad weather. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what you need to talk about your presentations for the project briefing. And so first, let's pull up the project briefing description again, and then we'll look at the memo description and kind of compare the two. Probably should make this bigger though for you. Can you read it? There's a lot of seats up here too. I'm not going to go much bigger than that. Okay. So starting next week, we need to get the project 2 presentation started. And I'm going to scroll on to the assignment prompt. Present a 12 to 15-minute oral briefing as a team for a workplace audience. I'm the supervisor. This is, you're going to get feedback from me about sort of how to, make changes in your proposed schedule and plan to make sure that you're, working on a project that'll be successful in the end. So this is, you're making a proposal before you've invested a lot of time and resources in the whole thing. Your presentation, the oral presentation, has to include a couple things. One, a description of the topic for your proposal, and I've done a quick run through with everyone's topic, and so you need to be able to describe your topic, and 2, a description of the tentative team plan and process for completing the project. And that's number 2, we kind of really focused in on Tuesday. Number 1, we really were sorting out last week on Thursday. So these should be generally in place. So for this project, it's important to sort of figure out what is your perspective. I know a lot of the assignment prop describes it as your organization, and I do think it's important for you to define what your group is and how you're approaching this issue. And that's the thing you should define in the presentation. For example, Team 1, you guys are proposing to build low-cost, small homes in Midtown Detroit. And so your orientation is, would be as an organization that, is involved in architecture, construction, building buildings, right? And all the sort of knowledge about all the kinds of contracting that's required to, plumbing, electrical, carpentry, etc. What is your guys' focus again? What?
Batteries.
Oh, that's right, ceramic batteries. And so how do you guys see your orientation?
So the way I saw it was more as...
It's an engineering issue, right?
Yes, and then but also as this is going to be the world we're going to live in. We're the young generation,
Yeah.
And so we're talking to older people who have stakes in that.
So it's an engineering, so that's a rhetorical issue, how to market this,
Yeah.
which is something to think about. But you're approaching it from an engineering perspective. What would you call this? Is chemical engineering?
It's a little bit of
Electrical engineering? A little bit of both, huh?
some mechanical engineering to it.
Sure,
also,
okay.
And a lot of software engineering because there is a way to improve batteries.
Okay.
So We're probably gonna, because we have two mechanical engineers and two computer science majors, we're just gonna go through.
Yeah, good. So that's a good example. I like how you're drawing on your abilities there, and these are things to define too in the presentation. Your guys' project, what was yours again?
Public transit in the Metro Detroit area.
Okay, public transit in the Metro Detroit area. So it's like an urban planning perspective, right? Does that seem? Do you have another? Like, are there other perspectives you would add in there, or is it primarily urban planning? Okay. And then your guys were working on an app, right? Or what is your, unless has it changed?
We're autonomy in the food industry.
Autonomy and, oh, right. Yeah, the,
Robots.
yes, the AI, that's not an app, AI, automated robots in food production. So there's some computer science in there, right? And mechanical engineering and electrical. So, okay. So good. So think about, try to think about if you want to sort of like, present it as if you're like like a startup or an organization, you can do that. Defining sort of who you are is good. And then, so you're going to be presenting this to the class, and my role will be sort of the supervisor role, the one who can sort of like approve the project, okay, and move forward. So there is a persuasive element in this. But also, the rest of the class will situate themselves as, coworkers in this organization that you are sort of creating here, or imagining for your project idea. And so our role for the rest of the class will be to listen to the presentation from that perspective to the best that we can and give feedback. Okay, so let's now, does this part make sense of what's in the briefing description? Let's look at the memo, and I think this will help with Calvin's question too. So the memo is a little bit more specific. I mean, I'm going to go back. There is an outline in the briefing assignment description. So like this is a general perspective of things you should talk about. Describe the topic, give us the kind of background information that we need to know. What is the background information about AI robots building, with food, in the food industry? What's the background information on public transportation in Metro Detroit? You're focused on Metro Detroit, right? Metro Detroit is also background information for you, but a slightly different issue in terms of affordable housing in the midtown, downtown areas. And then for you guys, ubiquity of these kinds of batteries is a background issue, and then, how the ceramic battery fits into that picture. So what is to be accomplished? What is your team's objectives in this project? What is it that you're hoping to achieve? Building homes, creating a marketable ceramic battery, establishing an effective public transportation system. And is it building food production?
Reducing turnover rate, improving safety.
So it is about like creating these things. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, there's all these.
Integrating.
You're getting into the benefits of it,
Yeah.
right? Which is another issue. But the primary goal is to build these, and then what is the problem you're trying to resolve? So Ken, you were just getting at some of the problems you're trying to resolve, improving food safety. So if AI robots are managing plant growth, there's a lower risk of salmonella, which is salmonella in leafy green vegetables is very common. Or is it E. coli? I can't remember. It's one of the two. Salmonella. Yeah. Okay. So this maybe helps deal with that. Maybe there's other things. Maybe there are other problems that helps deal with. So those problems you should talk about early on when you describe the topic, and when you're talking about what you're trying to accomplish. You're trying to resolve problems, right? So address the problems you're trying to attempt to resolve. Why is it important that the project goes forward? So there you might think about some of the rhetorical moves, like the persuasive moves, like start with background qualifications of each member, establishing some credibility. Briefly describe each team member's contribution to the project. So what are the roles that should be defined in the team charter? How will the team communicate? That should be described in the team charter. Team accountability. How are we going to make sure that this project is successful? And then the schedule for the project. That's the task schedule. And so that schedule, try to make that specific. Talk about try to give us a sense of the issues you're going to research and how you're going to research them. Okay, so you should have some sort of presentation up here on the computer with graphics, etc. All right. There's another version of the outline that you can look at, sort of think about, like there should be someone who's doing an introduction to the presentation. Just have like one, I would probably say like that's one person's job, introduce the whole thing. Have body segments, have a conclusion. So, divvy up this work, everyone needs to speak. So you need to think about, who's the best person to place where. Everyone needs to speak for 3 minutes. The whole team's got to speak for at least 12 minutes. There'll be question and answer afterwards, just like with the summaries. And that'll be a place where you can get feedback on your project, and that will be helpful for you for the revising your memos, right? So I would suggest that you assign someone the responsibility of taking notes during the question and answer session. You might think about whose job is it going to be to answer questions, and maybe have 1 or 2 people take notes for the group and record both like the questions that you get and sort of the answers that the team gives. Because that information would you might want to think about how do we want to address this when we create the written version. Make sense? Questions about this then? Before now I switch to the memo. So what I would highlight in here is a lot of the stuff is similar to the other one. Think about who your audience and your stakeholders are. And this is a question I think Alex and I were talking earlier about primary and secondary audiences. I'm going to be a primary audience because I'm the one who's approving it, but you might think about who, like in your sort of like imaginary organization, what other people would be interested in this project. Maybe there's other organizations you might want to connect with. So if you're talking about manufacturing and you're sort of approaching this from an engineering perspective, like there's a whole other question of supply chain management and production and marketing that is not your purview, right? This is, and if you guys are focusing on designing small houses, that's not the same as getting electrical contractors and plumbing contractors, other kinds of, I don't know what other contractors you need to build these. You need those two for sure. So like think about those things. Who are the other sorts of groups that we would have to connect with to make this happen in real life? And then think about what do they need to know, and etc. So this part, you need to think about research methods, and this is something you should define in your oral presentation. And it's tentative here. Like this is all tentative. This is all, you're proposing a project. You're not doing the project yet, right? But over the course of the next 2 months, you're going to have at least one primary research activity and at least one credible secondary source. And those secondary sources, I think I talked about this, I don't know, maybe earlier this week or last week. Those aren't necessarily, for the purpose of these projects, academic sources. So, like if you're working on this urban, mass transportation issue, there's studies of transportation behavior in the Metro Detroit area that might not be coming from a university press, but is going to be might be coming from a government source. For you guys, you may very well want to look at news reports of, like popular press news reports of salmonella and leafy green vegetables, and investigative reporting that's credible. That might be an important source for you, right? To sort of establish that problem. So each group should think about this. One primary research activity and at least one credible secondary source. When I say primary research activity, do we all understand what I mean?
Can you elaborate?
Yeah, I'll elaborate. So there's two sort of basic worlds of primary research. There's qualitative research and there's quantitative research. There's actually something in the middle too, mixed methods, because you can take qualitative research and then analyze it using statistical methods. So for example, surveys ask for people's experience, but then surveys are often quantified by looking at like the typical response rate or the average number of people who say 3 out of 5 or whatever, right? Qualitative research methods include stuff like surveys, interviewing people, making observations. Quantitative research can be like doing some sort of experiment or doing, if you can collect, data, raw data from some source and then use some method, maybe a statistical analysis of that data. So you might look at, like I could see you might be able to very well find some raw data that already exists on transportation and then use some sort of statistical method to analyze that, to turn that data into information. The difference between primary research and secondary research is that when you read secondary research, someone's giving you an argument. They're explaining an idea that's based on their research, right? With primary research, no matter what it is you're looking at, and it could be textual analysis, interviews, observations, taking data that already exists and then analyzing it, you are creating information. You're creating meaning out of some sort of thing that's out there. Does that make sense? That was a quick. Any questions about primary research? So think about that as, what are some secondary, primary research activities you want to do. How are you, and then, you might think about how are you going to do the research, who's going to do the research, whose responsibility will these things be, and then this talks about describing your schedule, and then stuff like describing stuff that's in the team charter, whose roles, how you deal with problems, how you're going to do accountability, etc. Questions? I would develop the oral briefing in a way that helps you prepare for this. And then as far as how this looks, there's that sample of a like it's somewhere around 302 of just a proposal report. You can make your draft look like that, like a memo proposal. But like what your sections are, you can sort of like play with that a little bit as long as you address these sort of issues, audiences and stakeholders, research methods. You can just use this and turn this into a structure, that would probably be the easiest thing. But if you feel like there's something that you can't address with this structure, you can, play with it as long as it makes sense. All right, questions there? Everyone feels good? All right, so I want to stop here. So